The Dragonknight was first up on the list of classes in ESO to get a big overhaul. Not only did ZOS update the audio and visuals for each ability, they also swapped some of them around to different lines and even completely changed how a few of them function. The end result is quite a large buff for pure class DK, not quite enough for it to compete with subclassing in PvE, but definitely much closer than other pure classes at the moment. There were a lot of changes over the course of the PTS, so I wanted to get y'all caught up to where we landed going into update 49. So for this video, I'll break down the Dragonknight skills and passives. We'll talk about each morph and why you might decide to use one over the other. And then finally, the last section of the video, I'll cover several build options to give you guys some ideas for how to set up your DK for different scenarios in update 49. If you're already familiar with all the changes, you just want to skip ahead to the builds, I will have the timestamps in the description below. However, I think there's some good stuff in there that can help you to make some better informed decisions on which skills you go with. So I definitely recommend checking out the skill breakdown as well. Update 49 goes live on March 9th. I will have a separate video covering the other changes coming, but wanted to go over the Dragonknight in a standalone video since there is quite a lot to cover here. Alright, we'll start off with the Ardent Flame skill line. This was very popular to subclass into. However, due to some of the changes that we'll get into, I think this will mostly only be used now if your base class is a Dragonknight. Still a very strong line, but you'll see here in just a minute why it makes more sense to take it as a DK and not as another base class. So first up, we have the ultimate, Dragonknight Standard. At its base, this has received a fairly large rework and functions more as a support ultimate than one used for personal damage. However, that will change a little with the morphs. You give your allies 300 weapon and spell damage for 15 seconds and also reduce their damage taken by 10% instead of the big area of flame damage every second for 20 seconds that the previous version had. Looking at the morphs, Standard of Might definitely saw some complaints over the course of the PTS, as that was the big damage ult for Dragoknights. ZOS did respond to some of that feedback, however they did not return the flame damage to it, and it also only lasts 15 seconds now rather than the 20 seconds it lasted previously. But on top of the buffs that the base morph gives you and your allies, you also as the caster get an additional 15% damage done, 15% reduced damage taken, and 300 weapon and spell damage. So your allies get the 300 weapon and spell damage and 10% reduced damage taken, and you get 600 weapon and spell damage, 25% reduced damage taken, and 15% increased damage done. It's not as strong for your personal damage as it was before without that strong flame AoE, but it's definitely not bad, and you provide some nice buffs for your allies at the same time. Then we have the other morph, Shifting Standard. This seems to be a little bit better for your personal DPS due to the 25-second timer on it. This loses the group buffs and instead just gives that big flame AoE that ticks every second for 25 seconds. It deals more damage than a Destro ult or a Meteor, but it is spread out over that long duration, so for short bursts it's not great, but for sustained encounters it's actually a very strong opening ultimate. If you are in group play and you are running this skill line and you don't have Standard of Might going, definitely recommend using that morph since that supports the group. However, if someone is already running that, the Shifting Standard morph can be a great opener for a fight. I do still kind of wish they would have made Shifting Standard the support morph, especially since you can move it around. But regardless, both morphs seem to have a place, so I think it ended up in a pretty decent spot overall. If you need to buff your group or you want the reduced damage taken bonuses, take Standard of Might. If you're just purely worried about personal damage done, take Shifting Standard. Alright, next up we have Lava Whip. It is still the main spammable in the Ardent Flame line, and both morphs have a basic attack and an empowered version. And just so you know what we're looking at, all of these tooltips will be shown with the base character stats, so 1k weapon and spell damage, 12k Magicka and stamina, and 16k health. For the Molten Whip morph, the base damage has been increased by about 3%, and the stacking can now trigger from any Dragonknight ability rather than only Ardent Flame skills, so the timer for the stacks was reduced from 15 seconds down to 10, but if you have enough DK skills slotted, this is actually much easier to keep up than before, and you'll stack up empowered hits way more often. I really like this new interaction as it rewards keeping and casting more Dragonknight skills. It still increases by 33% per stack, up to 99%, same as before. So with that slight increase to the base damage, the fully stacked whip now hits even harder than it used to, roughly the same as Merciless Resolve for the Nightblade. Then finally, the weapon and spell damage was removed and replaced with 5% damage done per stack against monsters, so 15% fully stacked, or 2% damage done against players, so 6% fully stacked. This is a decent little buff for PvP, but a huge buff for PvE. The nice thing about the damage done bonus is that it's not consumed when using the whip, so you can feel free to cast that every time you hit 3 stacks. You just can't go 10 seconds or longer without casting a DK skill once it's stacked to full. Then the final stipulation here is that the increased 6% damage done to players or the 15% to monsters only activates if your base class is a Dragonknight. Not sure how I feel about this. Maybe a bonus like this will make more sense once the full class refresh is done. Right now it definitely stands out because we don't have anything like it on other classes. But regardless, this large bonus makes the line very attractive to keep on a base DK, but not as appealing to pick up for subclassing from a different class. For the Flame Lash morph, the old version only healed you with the Empowered Whip, but now even your standard cast of this will heal you too, just for a smaller amount. The way this functions now is also a little different. Instead of automatically casting the Empowered version against an off-balance enemy, now when you hit an off-balance enemy with this skill, it will give you 5 stacks of the Empowered version to use whenever you like in the next 20 seconds. This gives you a lot more wiggle room to use how you want in your rotation, doesn't force you to drop everything else and spam this during off-balance windows. The Empowered hit was also greatly buffed from the previous patch, going up about 57%, and it now deals damage in a 5-meter radius around the target as well. This actually makes this morph really competitive with Molten Whip now. It also has that special functionality similar to Molten Whip where it adds the bonus damage to players or monsters. This triggers whenever you use the 5 stacks of the Empowered Whip, so for 45 seconds after that you'll have 7% more damage done to players or 14% damage done to monsters. Like the Molten Whip morph, this only activates if you're a Dragonknight, so again that makes this line way more appealing to use as a base DK than as a subclass line from another class. So which morph should you go with? Well, both are very good depending on your build. Stamina DKs will likely want to use the Molten Whip morph since that splits the cost, while Flame Lash only costs Magicka. So for now, Flame Lash will be a Mag DK only morph for most scenarios. Also, if you're utilizing other spammables in the DK kit like Magma Fist or Engulfing Dragonfire, these synergize very nicely with Molten Whip, so you'll want to go with that morph since those add to its stacks. Flame Lash is very strong, but you will need to make sure to have off balance triggered reliably in order to take advantage of it. If you have the Earthen Heart line, this can be done with the Mountain Giant passive that we'll talk about later. However, dealing a heavy attack every off balance period to trigger this is a bit of a DPS loss, so ideally a group mate could trigger this for you, or if you're solo, there might be some other options you want to look into in your kit for that. But it's definitely something to consider when deciding if you want to go with this morph. That off balance is very important. The self-healing is also a really nice perk for Flame Lash over Molten Whip. For damage, they're pretty comparable, and honestly, I'm glad Zos has these morphs in such a good spot relative to each other right now. Next up, we have Searing Strike. This single target dot ability now lasts for 10 seconds instead of 24 seconds, but they greatly increase the damage it does per tick to compensate for having to cast it more often now. The healing on the Burning Embers morph now scales with your max health instead of scaling with your damage done. This ends up as a nerf to the healing for most scenarios unless your dots were ticking for very low amounts. Venomous Claw has been renamed to Searing Claw and now deals flame damage like the base morph instead of changing to poison damage. The increase in damage is also a fair bit smaller. It's only 10% instead of 12%, and it only ramps up 5 times instead of 12. However, because the base damage of the skill itself was increased, it still ticks a bit higher on average than the previous version. Choosing between the two morphs really just comes down to whether you prefer the heal or the extra damage. Searing Claw is no longer way out ahead of Burning Embers the way it used to be, so it doesn't feel as mandatory to take as a damage dealer. However, on the flip side, Burning Embers also doesn't heal as much on a damage dealer as it used to. Overall, both morphs are fine to take. Choose the one that best suits your scenario. All right, moving on to the next skill. Inhale has been renamed to Core of Flame and moved from Draconic Power here to Ardent Flame in place of Fiery Breath. This is a delayed burst skill, and the duration has been changed from 2.5 seconds to 4 seconds, and the initial hit on it has been removed. Instead, it now restores a ton of magic and stamina while it's active, 15% of your missing amount per tick. The Heart of Flame morph, previously Draw Essence, adds in 15% of your missing health as well. This part is okay, but doesn't seem nearly as impactful as the Resource Restore. The final hit on this does deal more damage than the previous version, but since it loses that upfront hit, overall the skill deals less damage than before. The timed burst potential is slightly better though. Then the Soul of Flame morph, previously Deep Breath, continues to interrupt with the initial cast, and anyone interrupted is set off balance and stunned. Then the final explosion deals more damage now, the same tooltip as a cast of Wrecking Blow or Biting Jabs, so this definitely adds in some really nice timed burst potential. However, the overall damage from this skill is lower due to the removed initial hit. One nice change though, the old version you actually had to hit enemies with that initial hit for the second part to go off. You don't have to do that anymore. So now you can just cast it and run into a pack of enemies and have it explode alongside of everything else. So you can pre-buff it before you run into the pack of enemies. Makes it a very nice option for AoE scenarios. For PvE, neither morph is very appealing from a single target damage perspective, but it's very solid for AoE heavy encounters. These skills definitely shine when used for the resource restore though, whether on a tank or a damage dealer. If you're using it for that, it does its job really well. As a tank, this is a great way to restore your stamina while you're blocking. As a damage dealer, this is a nice way to get away with food or potion options that you might not normally be able to. For example, you could play safer and use the armor potions, which make you a lot more tanky. Normally, these are unsustainable for most setups due to them not having Magicka or stamina return on them. However, with Core of Flame, this is often doable. As a damage dealer, I think I'd always go with the Solo Flame morph. For a tank though, the choice would likely be whether you want to use it for an interrupt or not. Personally, I think I'd rather see the interrupt moved over to the Heart of Flame morph and then more damage put into the Soul of Flame morph. But regardless, these are both great options right now to help out with your sustain. Next, we have Hearthfire, formerly Ash Cloud. This is an AoE heal over time that also provides some minor buffs to allies inside of it. The duration of the base ability and both morphs is slightly shorter, down from 18 seconds to 15 seconds. Cinder Storm is now called Firekeeper. The base healing done on this is lower, but increases back to the same amount as before if you are standing inside the healing circle. This also gives minor fortitude and minor heroism for 15 seconds to anyone that is healed instead of the reduced movement speed on enemies that the previous version had. Pretty nice change. Overall, one of the strongest heal over time skills in the game. The other morph, Hearth and Home, was previously called Eruption. This was definitely a sad moment for me with the changes. Eruption was a really great damage over time skill, and now they've changed it so that both morphs of this ability are heals instead of one being healing and one being damage. Really like to see the opposite personally, more morphs that are very distinct in function. So I feel like we moved backwards a little bit with this one. On this morph, your heal scales with your max health. However, unless your stats are just really low, the other morph is going to heal for more, even as a tank with a high health pool. However, this morph does offer the caster major protection while they're inside it, so it's a really nice option for defense while also healing allies and offering them minor heroism. Usually for major protection, you end up slotting Revealing Flare on your bar, which doesn't have any other function for PvE, so this is definitely a nice alternative way to get it. This also retains the old function of reducing enemies' movement speed. Overall, when deciding between the two, it really comes down to if you're needing that major protection or not, and as a healer, you'll definitely do significantly more heals per second with the Firekeeper morph. Next we have Inferno. This is a very large 8-meter radius direct damage hit. It functions more similarly to a damage over time skill in the way that it's used, but it is direct damage. It fires automatically when you cast it and then every 5 seconds after for 15 seconds. The Flames of Oblivion morph is now called Incinerate. The way this ability is used is pretty similar to before. It just no longer fires the 3 balls of flame at the 3 nearest targets and instead deals damage to everything in an 8-meter radius. The tooltip on this was also increased by about 10%, and the chance to apply burning is increased as well. Previously, it would have been a 10% chance since it counted as a single target direct damage ability. Going to AoE damage, it should have dropped to 5%, but they instead gave it a special buff to essentially have 3 times the chance to apply burning compared to what a normal AoE direct damage ability would. So it's a really nice extra perk they've added on. It does have a reduced range from the previous version since that shut out projectiles, but the damage is better on the new version and it can hit more targets at once. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this change. Cauterize received pretty similar treatment in that it no longer fires projectiles and just covers a big area instead. This one retains the huge radius though at 15 meters and heals up to 6 allies within that area, instead of only 4 with the previous version. So pretty nice buff to this one too. Choosing between these two is pretty easy, as Incinerate is for damage and Cauterize is for healing. I will say, as a damage dealer, if you need more heals, unless your group is just really begging you to run it, keep Incinerate and find another route. It's just too good of a damage skill to drop. All right, now we'll go through the Ardent Flame passives. First up, we have Combustion. So this used to also increase the burning and poisoned damage on top of the resource restore, but they removed that part. Now it just restores Magicka and stamina when you apply burning. They did reduce the cooldown from 3 seconds to 1 second, so the potential for more sustain is there now. The amount on each tick is lower, so you will need to trigger that every 1.5 seconds in order to come out on top from the old version. This should be doable on most DK builds, but for healing and tanking, this is likely a bit of a nerf to those using this skill line. Next we have Warmth. This was renamed to Traumatic Burns. This now causes targets to take 5% increased damage from flame damage attacks. Essentially, this is the old Engulfing Flames effect, but on a passive now instead of a skill. I don't really love this unless they plan on adding in similar damage taken bonuses to Frost and Shock damage for other class kits. Flame has always been disproportionately the damage element. It's fine to do more for DKs, but it shouldn't be the all-around choice simply because debuffs are made available for it and not for other elements. Regardless, it's a pretty decent passive considering most of DK's damage is now flame damage. This one's very easy to keep up for a damage dealer, but could be tricky for a support role. Next up, we have Searing Heat. The name has been changed to Fan the Flames, and this now increases your chance to apply the burning status effect and also increases your damage done with burning. So this was moved off of that combustion passive, but it doesn't have the poison damage increase anymore. So this is the base amount without any DK skills slotted, but the chance does increase by 10% and the damage by 5% for each DK ability slotted. So with only one DK ability, that would be 60% and 30% there. If you had your bar fully loaded with DK skills, it would be 110% and 55%. Most setups will probably find themselves somewhere between the two. Personally, I think this passive could still use a little bit more juice. The burning damage definitely is up from last patch, but it doesn't seem like it quite covers the loss from the extra poison damage that we used to have. Then finally, Burning Heart was renamed to A Soul Ablaze and moved here to the Ardent Flame line in place of World in Ruin. This is slightly nerfed to 8% instead of 9%, so kind of a boring passive here in my opinion. I mean, healing taken is okay to have, but it certainly isn't presented in an exciting manner. This seems like a prime candidate for a dual passive that has some healing taken plus some other function to it. Overall, the passives are decent here, though losing the additional poison damage and World in Ruin passive definitely hurts a bit. Really, the best passive in the kit is on Lava Whip, and that one only works if you're a DK. So that's the main reason that if you want to take this skill line, it is kind of important that you are a base DK. Otherwise, it's a fair bit of a downgrade from the previous patch. But their idea overall is to spread the love out between the three lines and not just have one line stacked for a particular role. So that will make a lot more sense once all of the classes are addressed, but I think they did a really good job of it here with the DK, as Ardent Flame did lose a little bit of juice in some ways, but for damage, Draconic Power and Earthen Heart definitely got a lot better. So let's go through the Draconic Power skill line, starting out with their iconic ultimate, Dragon Leap. I'm so happy with the changes they made here. The core of the ability feels the same to use as before. You leap at your foes and stun them. They also did some really great stuff here that gives me a lot of hope for combat balance in the future. So first off, they split how the knockback works when you land in PvP versus PvE settings. If you hit a player, they are knocked back 4 meters and stunned for 2 seconds. If you hit a monster, they are knocked straight up into the air and stunned for 3 seconds. This stops that annoyance when you stack things up in PvE and then you ruin those stacks with the leap, but still keeps the awesome knockback in PvP. So this is the kind of separate balancing players have been asking for so long. It doesn't fundamentally change the skill. Players can still understand how it works in both environments. It just makes it operate in a better way for each of the game modes. For the Take Flight morph, this now deals flame damage instead of physical to better synergize with the kit as a whole. So while the damage on the tooltip for the leap itself was reduced a bit, some of that is made back up due to it being flame damage. But the big thing that they added that makes this so awesome is the second part. Upon activation, you receive a 10% damage done bonus in PvP and a 20% damage done bonus in PvE for 15 seconds. This not only brings that initial hit back up to close to around where it was before, it also increases all of your damage for 15 seconds. This is so good. And again, the separate balancing for PvE and PvP is beautiful. 20% damage done would have probably been busted for PvP, but 10% would have been no good for PvE, so they balanced them separately. This is exactly what we've been wanting. This is such a fun ultimate to use now regardless of your game mode. So the premise of it is kind of similar to the Nightblade's Deathstroke ultimate, except this one costs more at 125 ult, but it boosts all of your damage instead of only damage to the target that you're attacking. So really awesome change overall, probably my favorite of the whole rework. And it has a cool interaction with one of the morphs of Dragonfire Breath, which we'll talk about in just a minute. The other morph, Ferocious Leap, has a lower tooltip for damage, but it does give you a really big damage shield. This tooltip is at 16k health here, so it would be twice that amount at 32k health. Sadly, that's all it does though. So when choosing between the two, I don't see Ferocious being very appealing for tanking because it doesn't have any other secondary effects. And for PvP, I feel like the damage on Take Flight is just too good to pass up, especially since the shield will be cut in half in PvP. Obviously for PvE damage dealing, Take Flight is the no-brainer morph. I'd love to see Ferocious Leap get some other secondary effects to make it a bit more appealing. Maybe for support like a unique debuff when the enemies hit for 15 seconds, or even just a smaller version of the damage done bonus that Take Flight has, like 5% for PvP and 10% for PvE. I do think this needs a little love though, because the other morph is just fantastic right now. Overall though, I love what they did here with Take Flight. It has me very hopeful for the future class reworks. Next up is Dragonfire Breath, previously called Fiery Breath. This was moved from Ardent Flame into Draconic Power. Similar to Searing Strike, this skill has been reduced from 24 seconds down to 10 seconds, but had the damage over time greatly increased to help make up for it. I really love the new animation on this one. The Noxious Breath morph has been renamed to Disintegrating Dragonfire and converted to flame damage instead of poison damage. I don't really like the new icon here. It kind of looks like they used MS Paint to remove the green from it. Having Major Breach on it is definitely nice for AoE. However, the duration reduction to 10 seconds makes this a pretty underwhelming way to apply it compared to the old 24-second version, or comparing it to the 14 seconds you can get from Razor Caltrops for AoE, or 30 seconds single target from Elemental Susceptibility. Kind of wouldn't mind seeing this increase to 16 seconds since it is a bit harder to apply in an area than Caltrops. I'd also like to see the initial hit increase so that it could be a decent AoE spammable. With the current state of AoE spams like Biting Jabs, Fate Carver, even the other morph of this skill that we'll cover in a second, having a little more juice put on that initial hit could be nice and make it feel a little bit better to build up your whip stacks with as well. Overall, it's not bad, but this one definitely feels a bit left behind compared to some of the other skills in the rework. The other morph, Engulfing Dragonfire, however, offers a very fun new playstyle for the Dragonknight. Instead of this being a 1-second instant cast skill, this gets converted over to a flame channel that lasts about 5 seconds. It ticks every half second and increases in damage with each tick by 5% up to 50%. So by the end, this thing is hitting like a truck. Then it has the cool interaction with Take Flight I was talking about earlier as well. When you cast that ability and get your 15-second buff, this hits at the full 50% damage increase for every tick. So for 3 casts in a row of this, you get those max damage ticks if you use it after you leap. It's a really fun combo, and I love that they're adding in special interactions between abilities like this. Compared to the Arcanist Beam, the damage is pretty comparable, but it doesn't offer nearly the same safety net that Pragmatic Fate Carver can give you. Regardless though, it's really fun. I'm glad there's some alternative playstyles introduced that are a bit slower that also work really well. Choosing between these two morphs will really come down to how you want to build your character and what playstyle you want to go for. If you want to build it around the new channeled version with Engulfing Dragonfire, or if you want to stick to like a more traditional playstyle with a regular spammable, then you'll probably go with the Disintegrating Dragonfire morph. Using Engulfing, that will be your main spammable and take up the bulk of your cast and your rotation, whereas Disintegrating is more of an option to boost your whips with Molten Whip, or to provide that nice AoE Major Breach. Both options are fun, though I definitely think Disintegrating Dragonfire could use a bit of love. It's just a little underwhelming compared to all these other reworks we got. But I'll go over some setups using both of them later on in the video. Dark Talons and its morphs were the least reworked skills for Dragonknight in this patch. The base morph is identical. It's still an AoE immobilize that provides a synergy for your allies to activate on any enemies held within the grasp. Then the Choking Talons morph had the minor maim increased from 10 to 20 seconds, but honestly, this still feels very underwhelming to me. I'd love to see more done with this skill. Burning Talons did not receive any changes. Skill's decent for AoE, but with all the reworks, definitely feels a bit underwhelming now. Love to see something put on here to make it a bit more interesting to use. Next up we have Dragon Blood. No name change to the base morph. It's still a self-heal that provides major fortitude. However, the heal on it received a pretty nice buff. Instead of just restoring 33% of your missing health, it has a base tooltip value to it now that scales with your max health, and then that amount further scales based on your missing health. Green Dragon Blood is changing to Blood of the Green Dragon and maintains the buffed base heal along with the 5-second heal over time. This morph also continues to add in the major endurance and minor vitality. It's not terrible, but I feel like most tanks will be running potions that have major endurance already, because having that stam return on potions is really nice. For those situations where you don't have it on your potions, I guess this is decent, but I still feel like there's room for something a bit more interesting here on this morph. However, the other morph just got way more interesting. Coagulating Blood is now called Blood of the Elder Dragon. This scales off your offensive stats now instead of max health, and it's now not just a burst heal for you, but also for up to 5 additional allies in a 10-meter radius. And it also still keeps that increase for healing low health targets. This morph also gives minor courage, which is an excellent buff to be able to give to your group. So I really like what they did here a lot with this one. When choosing between the morphs, I feel like it's hard to beat Blood of the Elder Dragon. Yes, the green version has the heal over time, time, and potentially a larger burst heal for tanks depending on the stats that you have, but everything else about the Elder Dragon version is just far more appealing. Next up we have Protective Plate, which has been renamed to Wing Buffet, or as I'm going to forever call it, Wing Buffet. So the base morph of this was previously just the 50% reduced damage taken from projectiles. However, this now has a 4 meter knockback and stun to any enemies within 6 meters of you, and also gives you major expedition for 4 seconds. This is looking like a great tool for getting out of a tight situation. The Fleet Step Wings morph still adds in immunity to snares and immobilizations, but now combined with that juiced up base morph, this is a really great PvP option. A knockback and stun to anyone around you, then 4 seconds of major expedition and snare and immobilization immunity. And on top of that, you take 50% reduced damage from projectiles as you're trying to escape. I really love what they did here. Then the other morph, Protect the Brood, turns this into a group support ability. You lose the knockback and instead gain half of the projectile protection for your allies within 12 meters. You also give your allies minor protection for 20 seconds. This morph seems a bit more niche, but could be nice in a few particular spots. Choosing between these morphs will really come down to your role. I don't see the Fleet Step Wings morph seeing much PvE use, but that will likely be a very nice PvP option. And Protect the Brood is definitely more of a support role morph to take. And then finally for the Draconic Power skills, we have Fiery Grip. This was renamed to Chains of Flame. This still functions as a pull-in and can't be dodged or reflected. However, since the Major Expedition was put onto Wing Buffet, this opens up to have Major Cowardice put on it, which is a considerably more appealing secondary function. Major Cowardice was one of the big reasons everyone dropped this once Scribing came out and started using the chains there. However, those still seem to be a little bit cheaper to cast since you can put the Magicka and Stamina Restore on them. The Chains of Dominance morph does increase that Major Cowardice to 15 seconds to match the taunt duration, which is a nice improvement over the Scribing version. And for targets that can't be pulled, this is a free ability, so applying that debuff on bosses for free is really good. However, for pulling in lots of adds, the Scribing Chains might be the better bet still if you're having any sustain issues. This does have the guaranteed burning on the initial hit, which will help with sustain a little bit if you have the Ardent Flame line as well, but it isn't as much as the 600 mag and stam you get back from the Scribing version. Overall, I definitely think this has a place if you're using this line, but Scribing Chains might be preferable for some scenarios if sustain gets tight. The other morph is Chains of Devastation. This changes the ability to pull you to the target instead, and it gives you Major Berserk for 6 seconds and removes the Major Cowardice debuff and gives you Major Evasion for 10 seconds. I'd much rather than be 10 seconds on both, or if that's too strong, maybe meet in the middle and give 8 seconds for both buffs. I like the premise, you charge into battle, give yourself some extra damage and damage taken reduction, but I think this would feel a little better to use if those were lined up a bit better. Overall, the two morphs here have very different functions, so ultimately you'll just choose the one that fits your desired effect. If you need a chain or a free cast of a debuff on bosses, Chains of Dominance will be great for that. For charging into a fight, Chains of Devastation is the morph you'll want to go with. All right, moving on to the passives, we have Iron Skin, which was renamed to Burnished Scales. Nothing was changed with this passive. I do think that something additional probably could have been added here. Talk about that more as we look at the passives as a whole. World and Ruin was moved here from Ardent Flame and changed from 5% flame and poison damage to 7% extra to AoE damage and damage over time. This would be a bit juicier if that's stacked, so 14% to an ability that was in both of those categories, but unfortunately it just covers it once. So essentially every ability type except for single target direct damage is covered by this passive. It's pretty decent overall, but not appealing enough to be the only damage passive in this line. This is the main reason that if you subclass out of a DK as a damage dealer, this line is the first one to drop. I'll give an example later in this video. Elder Dragon was changed a bit as well. Instead of 323 health recovery per ability in this line slotted, it adds to your health recovery based on your missing health. This is still a bit meh overall, but they did at least add a group support buff to this with the Minor Brutality. This was previously on Mountain's Blessing in the Earthen Heart line. This is definitely nice to have if it's not provided, but it can be redundant if you have another person with the Draconic line or a Templar with the Dawn's Wrath line. Also, I think it's about time we moved away from separated brutality and sorcery here. Hybridization's been going for 6 or 7 years now. We still have these separated buffs. It's just a bit strange. Then Battle Roar was swapped to this line from Earthen Heart and renamed to the Storm Voice. Essentially, it functions the same as before, however, it has a lower baseline that increases in value per DK ability slotted. So at 1 ability, you're at 22 return per ultimate spent, and at 6 abilities, you're at 52 return per ultimate spent. Most players will probably find themselves somewhere between that. At 3 DK abilities, it is a very small nerf from last patch. At 4 abilities and up, it's a buff. Overall, the passives in this line definitely feel the most underwhelming of the three. That's a big part of the reason as a DPS, this is your first line to drop if you do want to take advantage of subclassing. Adding a little damage into Burnished Scales or improving World in Ruin could help even that out a bit. Alright, finally we have the Earthen Heart skill line. I was very impressed with how Zos handled this here. This line feels so much better to take for damage than before, and is now on par with many of the other desirable lines outside of the insanely stacked ones like Herald of the Tome and Assassination. Starting out with the ultimate, we have Magma Armor. This is a very nice survival ultimate as you are nearly invincible for the duration since it limits the incoming damage ticks to only 3% of your max health at a time. The base morph and the Magma Shell morph no longer deal flame damage, but have had their duration increased from 12 seconds to 15 seconds. This means that the Elfbane set no longer boosts this to 17 seconds since there's no flame damage component. However, now you have 15 seconds, which is only 2 seconds shorter without needing to run a 5-piece set, so I think it's a pretty fair trade-off. And the flame damage was never a big draw for this morph anyways, it was mostly just used for pure defense. They've also buffed the shield that you provide to your allies to 133% of their max health, up from 100%. So this is a very nice defensive option to buff your allies' defenses as well. I'm pretty happy with where this landed. Then the other morph, Corrosive Armor, is there if you're looking to forego some of that survival to deal more damage. The timer on this is reduced to 10 seconds, and instead of limiting attacks to 3% of your max health, this limits them to 6% of your max health. Still pretty nice, but not as tanky as Magma Shell, and there's no shield for your allies either. However, you do get a fairly strong AoE around you for 10 seconds. They buffed the damage on that part by almost 5 times the original amount. This isn't as strong as something like a Destro ult. It's about 75% of the way there, but it does allow you to be really tanky at the same time as you're dealing pretty good damage. Not to mention you also ignore the enemy's physical and spell resistance with your direct damage attacks. This is not really that big of a deal for PvE as you should be building for the proper penetration amounts when this is not active, but for PvP this is a huge selling point for this morph. So insanely tanky, strong AoE around you, and you ignore resistances with your direct damage. Just really strong ultimate overall. And they did change the damage on this from poison over to flame damage, so Elfbane will now work with this morph and boost it from 10 seconds up to 15 seconds. Overall, this is going to be a really great option for PvP. Could see it being a nice option situationally in PvE as well, particularly in cases where you're going for no death runs. You want to play a little bit safer without giving up too much damage. For choosing between the two morphs, really not too much to consider there. The Magma Shell version is more defensive and group support focused. The Corrosive version is more damage focused. Pick the one that better suits your needs and playstyle. Next we have Stone Fist. This has been reworked into Superheated Ward. This is now a single target damage shield that goes to you or an ally and scales off the higher of your max Magicka or stamina, and it's capped at 50% of the target's max health. The Obsidian Shard morph has been scrapped and now turned into Volcanic Ward. This adds 10% damage reduction on the next instance of damage taken and also provides a heal when the shield ends. I'm not sure how I feel about this whole next instance of damage taken part. That seems like it will likely get eaten by small attacks that don't do much damage anyways. Or if somebody's light attack weaving an attack against you, it will reduce the light attack instead of the big hit that follows. We'd like to see this get reworked to something like the next time you take damage, your damage taken is reduced by 10% for 2 seconds or 3 seconds, something like that. Can also see this one being a bit trolly if you're trying to shield yourself and it keeps going to an ally instead. Overall, this morph is not really a skill that I'm getting super excited about right now. The other morph, however, has had some really nice improvements to it. Stone Giant has been reworked into Magma Fist. It now has the icon that previously belonged to the Obsidian Shard morph. The base damage of the skill was increased by about 3%, and it no longer starts with an AoE component and then fires projectiles for the following cast. It's simply a ranged spammable now on every cast, has no cast time to it anymore. It does still build up the debuff, but they've renamed it to Heat Shock instead of Stagger. This stacks 3 times to cause the enemies to take 198 more damage from all attacks. This doesn't sound like a lot, but it goes early into the damage formula and benefits from tons of buffs and debuffs, so it really ends up adding up, especially considering that it affects every tick of every ability. It also has an empowered cast once every 6 seconds that deals 66% increased damage. Not as hard as an empowered whip, but still a really strong hit. This also pairs excellently with Molten Whip now that the stacks from that increase with every DK ability cast, so you can stack up your Seething Fury stacks with Magma Fist and then cast Whip when it hits 3 stacks. It's also a very nice debuff to have in the group, so I could definitely see a damage dealer being assigned Earthen Heart next patch to keep this up for everybody. Really great changes here for Magma Fist, great improvement to the skill overall. Choosing between these two morphs is fairly easy as they perform very different functions. If you need the shield, you can take Volcanic Ward. For a nice spammable and good synergy with Molten Whip, Magma Fist is a great option. Just keep in mind that it does cost stamina, so you'll likely need to be a stamina-based damage dealer to sustain keeping it up. Next up, we have Molten Weapons. This is a group-wide buff to give you and your allies major sorcery and brutality for 30 seconds. In Update 49, they also added a damage component to it where you deal additional flame damage with your light and heavy attacks every 2 seconds. This works out to a pretty standard dot, however, due to the long timer, it's actually a pretty efficient skill to use, especially the Igneous Weapons morph. Due to no longer having the duration increase passive, this is now 60 seconds instead of 72, but 60 is very easy to keep up. Getting a nice dot that you only have to cast once per minute is actually pretty strong and makes this a great skill to run on the back bar even if you don't need the sorcery and brutality. The Molten Armaments morph retains the 30-second duration but adds in the Empower buff. This doesn't seem too appealing even if you are doing a heavy attack build, as there are often better sources of Empower. It is a long source though, but I don't know if it's enough to make this morph with only half the duration of the other that appealing. It'd be cool to see something else worked in here too. Overall, unless you are planning to rely on this for your Empower buff, there's no reason to take the Molten Armaments morph over Igneous Weapons. The damage increase is the same, you just have to cast it twice as often, and the radius to give it to your allies is smaller on the Molten Armaments morph. Alright, next we have Obsidian Shield. This is a damage shield for you and your allies that scales off your max health. Other than the major mending duration increasing from 3 seconds to 4 seconds, the base morph of this ability is the same in Update 49. For the Igneous Shield morph, not a whole lot changed here either, except the shield that you get for yourself is about 12% stronger. So that plus the additional 1 second on the timer for major mending. For the Fragmented Shield morph, this now scales off the higher of your Magicka or stamina instead of your health. Essentially, it's 20% of your max resource, so as an example, 24k stamina as your max stat would give a 4800 size shield to you and your allies. This also increases the duration of the major mending from 4 seconds to 6 seconds. This is actually a nerf from last patch, as we had 8 seconds on major mending there. So when choosing between the morphs, depending on your stats, it's very likely the shield size for your allies will be larger with the Fragmented morph, even if you are a tank. So that's something to consider when using it. Your own shield as a tank will be larger with the Igneous morph. This is one of those skills I think I'd like to see a little bit more differentiation with in the morphs instead of just having a max health scaling morph and a max resource scaling morph, especially considering the tank might often opt for the resource scaling one to provide better shields for their allies. So would like to see this one get a little bit more love. Alright, next up is Petrify. This is a single target stun and debuff. It's been reworked a fair bit from the previous version. Previously, it was an instant stun that could not be blocked or dodged. Well, this new one, it still can't be blocked, but the application can be dodged and it has a 1 second duration after you cast it before that stun goes off. Previously, you could only cast this on a target that did not have CC immunity, but now you can cast it on anyone. So this means you'll have to actually be tracking that a little bit better to have the stun reliably go off when you want it to. They also upped the duration from 3 seconds to 4 seconds for players and all the way up to 8 seconds for monsters. This sounds nice, but unfortunately pretty much all the major enemies have CC immunity in PvE, and any ad that can be stunned is not going to be threatening enough to warrant needing to stun for 8 seconds. Although now that I think about it, maybe with the new Vestige mode coming for the Overland difficulty, this could be pretty interesting. Minor Breach was also added onto this ability for 10 seconds. It seemed like an attempt to give it some PvE relevance, but honestly that part is probably more useful in PvP. So that's a very easy and common buff to get in PvE, even in AoE. The Fossilized morph adds in the Immobilize when the stun ends. Similar to the old version, it also adds minor vulnerability and increases both durations to 20 seconds. Again, I don't really see this being PvE relevant as those are commonly sourced through other means, but should be nice debuffs to have for PvP. The Shattering Rocks morph adds back in the damage component when the stun ends, and like the previous iteration, also adds in a heal for you when the stun ends. Both of these values were buffed by 15% for Update 49. For PvE, I'm not really seeing a lot of appeal for either morph. I think we could get there with some small tweaks. For PvP, I'll be honest, I'm not really sure which morph seems more appealing. I'm gonna guess Shattering Rocks with the extra damage and healing. It's gonna win out over the Immobilize and the longer duration debuffs, but I think you might be able to make a case for both versions. Let me know what y'all think down in the comments below. I'm not really sure on this one. Then finally, in the Earthen Heart line, we have Spiked Armor, which was renamed to Earth Spike Mantle. This was moved into this line from the Draconic Power line. This is still the 20-second duration buff that provides major resolve, but instead of the Reflect that scales off your physical and spell resistance, it's now a flat 100 damage done added to all of your attacks while active. This functions like the heat shock debuff that we talked about earlier, where it doesn't seem like a lot, but it adds to each tick of every ability and gets buffs and debuffs, so it can really add in a decent amount of DPS overall. Hardened Armor has been renamed to Earth Shield Mantle, still gives the same size damage shield as before. It's also a pretty cheap damage shield, so it's a very nice option to spam if you need shields without using up too many resources. Volatile Armor has been renamed to Shatter Spike Mantle. It's mostly the same except the dot it applies now scales with your offensive stats instead of physical and spell resistance, so it will actually deal decent damage now. That plus the 100 base damage to all of your attacks make this a very good ability to run even if you don't need it for the major resolve. Kind of reminds me of Hurricane, how it's just a very solid DPS ability now that provides the major resolve. I really like what they did here a lot. It also gives you additional stacks of your landslide passive every 10 seconds, which we'll talk about here in a bit when we get to the passive section. Choosing between the two here is pretty straightforward. Earth Shield Mantle is a great option for tanking that provides a damage shield. Shatter Spike Mantle is a great damage dealer option and really kind of ended up being a must-run ability from this line for DPS. All right, now we'll cover the passives. First up, we have Scaled Armor. This has been renamed to Heart of Stone. This was moved here out of the Draconic Power line. Still provides the same armor value, a unique buff equal to minor resolve, so pretty nice to have for any role. Eternal Mountain was scrapped and changed to Landslide. I have to say I'm really happy they did away with the duration passives. I always thought those were kind of boring and they should just make the abilities last the length that they want them to without passives dictating that. So Landslide is a very slow ramping up damage done increase that maxes out at 10%. So this is a fairly decent damage done passive over a longer encounter, but pretty bad for a short one. By itself, the passive takes 50 seconds to stack up and only 20 seconds to lose. However, with Shatter Spike Mantle also triggering it every 10 seconds, this is brought down to about 30 seconds, and at just 10 seconds, we're already at 5%, which is pretty solid. I guess my main complaint is the reliance on Shatter Spike Armor to make this passive reasonable, and also the quick rate at which it falls off. Many encounters have phases where you can't really deal damage at all, so it could be a little bit annoying there. Overall, I think this is stomachable because it's not the only damage passive in this line. So next up we have Mountain's Blessing, which has changed to Blessing at the Peak. The minor brutality from this passive went over to Draconic Power, but in its place gained a 10% crit damage buff that's always active as long as you have this line. So really awesome addition to this passive here that came late in the PTS cycle. And then it also still has the ultimate generation. They have tweaked it though, so you don't actually have to cast an ability in this line to get the ult, but also if you deal damage with an ability in this line, you will get the ult return as well. So really happy where this passive ended up. And then the Helping Hands passive was reworked and renamed to Mountain Giant. You can no longer get stamina return casting abilities in this line, but instead you get stamina return when you deal a fully charged heavy attack. You also automatically set the target off balance when you deal a fully charged heavy attack. This seems pretty decent for support, but a little underwhelming for a damage dealer outside of heavy attack builds. It's just such a DPS loss in PvE to do a heavy attack unless you're specifically speccing into heavy attack damage, but overall still a nice way to return some stam when attacking with a magical weapon, or a decent bit of extra stam when attacking with a stamina based weapon. And then on demand off balance definitely has its uses. Overall, I'm okay with this one, but I wouldn't mind seeing something a bit more universally useful thrown in here too. All in all, the Earthen Heart passives are very nice. Good tankiness, good utility, and good damage. Really like where these ended up. It makes this line pretty appealing to take now. All right, we made it all the way through the skills and the passives. Thanks so much for sticking with me this far. If this video has been helpful to you, subscribing to the channel does help out a lot. I love doing these deep dive videos, and we'll definitely be trying to do one for every class rework. But now it's time to get into some builds. I'll have quite a few different setups here that have been put together by some really great players in the community. I'll start out with some pure DK setups, then cover some subclass options, and then show a few support DPS examples as well. Try to cover a variety of play styles from group play to solo, even some one-bar setups. First up, we'll go over a Molten Whip spam setup from Geldis. Big shout out and thanks to him for letting me share this with you guys. This is a stamina DK. He got to 169k DPS. He has a video for this setup as well at 166k, but he ended up going back and getting a little bit higher after he posted that. But if you want to check out his video to see the rotation, I'll have that linked down below. Obviously, all the gear chosen here is specific to the situation. All of the normal good options like Velothi, Onsul, Tideborn also work depending on the type of encounter that you're going up against. Shifting Standard does seem to be the best option for damage on a dummy parse. This is definitely a setup for group play, and for pure single target damage, swap to Velothi if there are priority adds in the fight to deal with. For a solo play whip setup, shout out to Hyperioxys. He has a great website and YouTube channel with lots of builds. Highly recommend him. He has quite a few different setups here for different sorts of scenarios, and he'll have all of the important buffs and debuffs covered to do well for solo play. I'll have this page and his YouTube video for it linked down below. Next, we have the Magicka Flame Beam setup from Kortekk. He doesn't have a YouTube channel to link, but he posts a lot of good stuff in the DPS Nerds Discord server. Many of them are pinned, but you can also use the search feature to type his name and toggle on Has Image. Big thanks to Kortekk for letting me share this. This one got to 155k. Much easier rotation here compared to the whip builds and very solid AoE damage. Build setups for this are going to be similar to Arcanist Beam builds. Deadly Strike, Tideborn, Onsol, these will all be very good options depending on the specific encounter that you're facing. For this flamethrower playstyle for solo play, I had a lot of fun running around Overland in this setup here. It doesn't have a ton of incoming healing, just breathing blows the champion point node slotted. So you definitely need to swap in an extra heal or something like Pale Order for more intensive healing scenarios. But this was pretty comfy, pretty easy rotation as well. Just pre-buff Igneous Weapons, Quick Cloak, and Incinerate. Just make sure you're in range when you cast Shatterspike Mantle so that it applies the dot. Start stacking your Landslide passive quicker. After you do the Dragon Leap, you want to try to get in 3 Flame Breaths here to take full advantage of that 50% damage boost there. It's really a fun setup. Whip can be cast as well at 3 stacks. It hits really hard. The only thing that kind of sucks is having to block or dodge stuff as it messes up the ramping damage on that flamethrower. You also move really slow while you're casting it, so just something to keep in mind there, but this definitely offers a fun new playstyle for the DK. This setup was for Overland, so you only need 9.1k penetration, which is very easy to get with Elemental Susceptibility slotted. I also went with Double Charged. It seemed pretty similar to Nirnhoned Charged, though maybe slightly better with the DK's burning damage increase. I also wasn't wearing a trial set because you don't need one in Overland since the 3-piece Slayer bonus doesn't work here. I definitely recommend swapping to something like Onsol or Null Arca for dungeon and trial content. If you're looking for a really good dungeon setup, Onsol, Tideborn, and Velothi with a light piece or two, this will probably work out really well for you. If you are solo and going up against multiple enemies, probably best to drop Elisus and put Razor Caltrops in its place. This works very well for an AoE Major Breach since you don't have access to the Incinerating Morph with Major Breach since you're doing Beam Breath. Really just so satisfying to spam this in an AoE though. I also put together a 1-bar version of this flamethrower setup. I didn't spend a ton of time here, but had a couple of setups that broke 120k DPS on the trial dummy. This one here is at 122k with Narayanith. Really easy setup. You only have 3 skills to press plus your ultimate, using a 4-piece Highland plus Narayanith and Null Arca. I also tested the same setup with Deadly Strike, roughly the same damage range. After further testing, Double Charge probably would have been a little bit higher here on these instead of using Nirnhoned and Charged. You can also do this with Oakensoul too, of course. Velothi was just a little more damage for running around soling Overland. This setup here worked really well. If you need to swap to Pale Order for more heals, I dropped Tideborn for Zogvin's Warband so that you still have the minor force. I tried dropping Shatterspike Mantle as well since Oakensoul already gives major resolve, but it seemed like quite a large DPS loss when I did. Overall, I was having a lot of fun with the Flame Beam setups. They aren't quite as strong as the whip builds, but they're very simple to play and have a ton of AoE damage. Next up, I'll go through some subclass builds involving the DK. First, we have a setup from Charles. Big shout out and thanks to him for letting me share his setup. I'll have his YouTube video linked down below if you want to check out the rotation. He's using Ardent Flame, Earthen Heart, and Assassination. So he dropped Draconic Power, and he's on a Stam DK in this one. Got some pretty crazy damage at 184k DPS. The gear and skill setup is very single target focused, so think of this as a possible setup for group play for an encounter that has only one priority target. Definitely swap the Huntsman Mythic to Velothi if you need more cleave damage. For his ultimates, he opens with Shifting Standard and then uses Incapacitating Strike for the remainder of the fight. Great stuff here. Keep an eye on his channel. I think he might have some more setups coming before the patch hits. Kortekk also did a Flame Beam setup with subclassing. This one has Draconic Power, Adric Spear, and Herald of the Tome. Seem to be pretty similar in damage to the pure DK Breath build, but you have a lot more penetration here, plus the option to slot an Adric Spear skill for more crit damage as well. This could be a really fun one to try out. You could probably also do Assassination here instead of Adric Spear and just slot Incap or Soul Harvest on there. Should work with that as well. Kortekk also did a build using Ardent Flame, Earthen Heart, and Adric Spear, using Jabs as the main spammable. This looks like a fun setup too. Don't get too hung up on the specific gear on any of these. These are all flexible to swap in Velothi and the other gear sets that we've been discussing. And then for those looking to run as a support DPS, Geldis also put together a setup for pure DK, got him 128k DPS. In this one, he's running Encratis, Alkosh, and Zens. So Searing Claw, Disintegrating Dragonfire, Carve, Shatter Spike Mantle. These are all your dots that count as Zen. And then also the dot from the Alkosh set, that'll count as well. So you got 5 there. So those plus Burning and Poisoned, you do have some wiggle room to drop a specific skill, like maybe Carve. If you need something in particular slotted, you'll still have plenty of dots for Zen. And then in this setup here, it's pretty similar, but he dropped Draconic Power, added in Assassination, got him a fair bit more damage. So it seems like this might be the go-to setup for Zen DK for update 49. Overall, subclassing is definitely still the route to the highest damage for a damage dealer and the most utility for a support role, but the gap has shrunk substantially for the Dragonknight. It's far and away the best pure class at the moment. It makes me really excited to see what's coming for the other classes as they get their turn with the class refresh. Warden will be up next, so I'll definitely keep you all up to date on the news there. But what do you guys think about the DK rework? Did it go as you expected it to? Let me know down in the comments below. But that's going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If this video has been helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the sub notification bell to be alerted to new videos. Big shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Really appreciate the support. There are memberships for as little as $3 a month. It definitely helps out a ton. More info in the description below for that. And a special thanks to these folks here. I couldn't keep doing this without you. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.